Good afternoon. We're going to continue today with clustering, and I'm going to start now with hierarchical clustering. So, basically, this first block here, this first hour, will be about hierarchical clustering and two different approaches to hierarchical clustering, and also how we can use clustering to group features instead of grouping examples. So this could be one way of reducing dimensionality by grouping features that are similar to each other. So first, let's start with the idea of hierarchical clustering. We want to create groups, but not all at the same level. We want to create groups of groups. This can be useful to represent something like in phylogenetics you have this tree of life. We have some large groups like bacteria, for example, and then we have subgroups of these, and these are distinct from large groups like eukaryota and other groups like mammals and things like that. So with hierarchical clustering, we want to create groups at different levels and basically create a tree that represents how the data is organized, how the examples relate to each other. Another example here, we have our features here are gene activity level for different genes, and we can organize, for example, a family of organisms or cell types or something like that, which are not just organized at the same level in different clusters, but they form families or smaller groups are grouped into larger groups and so on. And we usually can represent this with a dendrogram, a diagram like a tree that represents this nesting of different groups. So basically, suppose that we have a data set like this. We have here two pairs of examples that are very close together. Then we have this one here a bit on the side and that one more distant. If we want to create a hierarchical clustering of this set, we could start by grouping together the two pairs that are very close to each other. So these would be two groups here. This one is alone, but then is grouped along with D and E. So F, D, and E will then form a group at another level. Then we have all of these here below forming a single group. And then finally A gets grouped with the rest. So we have this notion of how groups will be formed by going further and further in some sense of distance and bringing together other groups or other elements into the group gradually. So here we can see that we need some notion of distance, not only between the examples, which is what we always need when we do clustering, but also we need to be able to figure out which groups are more distant or which groups are closer together. So as we saw in the beginning when we started looking at clustering, there are many different ways of having this general notion of distance, difference, similarity, and so forth. So we have different terms. We can talk about proximity or how alike examples are, similarity too, but usually when we talk about similarity, it usually refers to a measure between 0 and 1, although sometimes the word can be used in different senses. Distance is a special case of a measure of similarity or dissimilarity that meets these criteria, must be 0 or greater, cannot be negative, must be symmetrical, so measured from one point to the other, it must be equal to the measurement going the other way, and must respect the triangular inequality. So in order to be a distance, it must be some measure of dissimilarity that respects these criteria. And there are some measures of distance that are often used. Euclidean is one we use in general. I use in general in these examples because it's very intuitive. We can use the square of the Euclidean distance, so this is basically the same thing, but we don't take the square root. We can use Manhattan distance, where we add the absolute values of the differences in the coordinates. The name comes from the streets in the island of Manhattan, where everything is in those 90 degrees turns. And so you have many different ways of measuring distance. or more generally even similarity or dissimilarity. So we saw several of these examples for measuring dissimilarities or similarities between examples in our data set. But there are a few more we did not consider, but this is just to give you an idea of how diverse these measurements can be. For example, Mahalanobis distance is normalized by variance and covariance between the different attributes. The Hamming distance is usually used for comparing text and strings because it's the number of differences in the strings. This Levenstein distance is a more general measurement that also takes into account the possibility of deleting a part of the string or inserting new elements into the string. So this is something that we try to measure, for example, when comparing DNA sequences or protein sequences. And there are many different measures that you can use that depend on the problem itself. So this is one thing. We want to measure in some way similarity or dissimilarity between different examples. But in hierarchical clustering, we also need to figure out which groups are closer together when we start building groups from groups. And so we also need to compare distance or to measure similarities and dissimilarities between groups. And this is called linkage, the measurement of distances or dissimilarities between groups. And now we have several different ways of measuring linkage. For example, single linkage takes the distance between two groups, two clusters. We have cluster J and cluster K, to be the minimum of the distance between all pairs of points, taking one point from one cluster and another point from the other. So the minimum distance of examples between the two clusters will be the distance between the clusters. And this is called single linkage. Complete linkage takes the maximum distance of pairs of points between the two clusters. So you see, we have one measurement of the similarity between points. In this case, it's distance for this example. But we have two possible linkages that we can define in this way. In fact, we have a lot more of them. For example, centroid linkage takes the distance between the mean points of the clusters. Then average linkage takes the mean of the distances between the points on the clusters, which may not be the same thing. The median linkage uses the median. Then word linkage is actually a minimization of the sum of square errors. So for all the points in one cluster, we take the sum of the square distances between the points and the center of the cluster. And we do that for all clusters and then try to minimize that. So we have different ways of trying to bring together, to figure out which clusters to join together into the larger groups in hierarchical clustering. And this is the linkage problem. So basically, for hierarchical clustering, we need some way to compare examples, to measure similarity and dissimilarity between examples. That's the same problem we had in partitional clustering too. But we also need to measure some dissimilarity or similarity between clustering, between clusters. And this is the linkage problem, the linkage measurement that we're going to use. The advantages of hierarchical clustering can be, on one hand, we don't really need to specify a number of clusters because we will have all the tree, that representation of clusters within clusters, that then we can use to decide how to put the examples together. Also, this hierarchical organization will ideally reflect some structure of the data. So it must mean something. Otherwise, there's not much point in doing hierarchical clustering. Some disadvantages. As you can imagine, there are many different combinations of possible clusters within clusters that we can have. And usually the hierarchical clustering algorithms do not go through all the possible combinations. They try to do clustering in a greedy way, so in the end the clustering may not be ideal depending on how complex our problem is. And also, if the data itself does not have a hierarchical structure, then the hierarchical clustering will simply be the result of the algorithm itself, and may actually be more confusing when we try to use it on the data than not clustering at all. So remember that clustering should follow something that is real, so to speak, that is part of the structure of the data. So two approaches to hierarchical clustering. We can do hierarchical clustering from the bottom up, starting with individual examples, and then bringing them together into larger and larger clusters. This is called agglomerative clustering. We start with clusters of one example each, and then we bring the closest clusters together and start building clusters from there. Generally, the complexity of this approach is on the order of the cube of the size of our data set, which tends to be a bit heavy, but we can improve that if we add linkage constraints. Only some groups, some pairs of examples can be considered to be together. We're going to see how this works in more detail later on. Divisive clustering is the inverse approach. We start from the top, everything in a single cluster, and then we split that cluster and split again, and so on. If we do binary splitting, if we split in two, then we consider all the possible combinations, all the possible splits, we have a complexity on the order of 2 raised to the size of our data set, which is extremely high. So this is exponential on the size of our data set. However, we generally use algorithms that are much faster than this because they do not consider all the possibilities. They use heuristics and some faster approaches that tend to be good enough in general and are a lot faster than this complexity. And also, it can be better than agglomerative clustering if we want just a few clusters from the top. Because if we start from the bottom, we need to build the whole tree up to the top until we figure out what the structure of the tree is in the larger clusters. On the other hand, if we start with everything grouped together and then split, we need only go down a few levels if we want a small number of clusters. So let's see an example of agglomerative clustering to illustrate. We start with our data in single clusters, and then we use a linkage function, a linkage measure, to determine which clusters are closer together. And now we're going to bring together those that are closest, and then the next ones, and so forth, and we start building those clusters from the bottom up until we get everything in the same tree. Note that only when we reach the end do we know where everything connects to each other. So we cannot determine which clusters are inside which clusters completely until we reach the end of the process. The result can then be represented as a dendrogram, as a scheme for a tree, a representation of the tree, where we can show the smaller clusters, and then as we go higher here, we show them grouping together. This is the final result. We have a hierarchy of clusters, the smaller clusters inside larger clusters, but we may want to convert this into a partitional clustering. So we may want to cut somewhere on the tree and group those elements together, and so create a set number of disjoint groups and not nested like in hierarchical clusters. So what we can do is to select a level on the dendrogram where we can cut. For example, we can cut here between these two branches, and we have these two groups, or we can, in this case, we would cut this branch here, so we separate our data into two groups, or we can go down more and separate the next branching and so forth, so we can decide where in the tree we're going to cut and convert hierarchical clustering into a partitional clustering by just cutting the tree at those points. So in this case we have 4 clusters, 5 clusters, and so on. So you see, this is the problem that we saw in the beginning. How do we define clusters? How many clusters we have in our data set? If we use hierarchical clustering, we can postpone that decision until after the clustering is done, and then decide by some means which way it's best to cut our tree and convert the hierarchical clustering into a partitional clustering. Or alternatively, we can not cut it and retain the hierarchical clustering. So the question is whether, for our purposes, it's better to represent the structure of these data with a tree that represents all the nested clusters, or if we just want to partition the data into a set of clusters at the same level. Now, we can, for agglomerative clustering, it's often that we use connectivity constraints, not only because of the complexity of this algorithm, so to make it faster, but also because it makes it easier to capture some additional structure in our data. For example, if we use linkage measures that are based on distance and dissimilarity between our points and linkage between the groups based on distance, we will have clustering that groups together points that seem to be on different parts of this spiral here. For example, this blue cluster includes both parts of the spiral. This may not be what we want, and so we may force clustering by adding linkage constraints. And these tell the algorithm that only some pair of examples can count as linking together clusters as we build the clusters from the bottom up. So let's see an example here. We can use agglomerative clustering from scikit-learn. We also can get this method for the k-neighbors graph. And what this does, the k-neighbors graph, is given a matrix of coordinates for our points and the number of neighbors we want to include. It will give us a sparse matrix that has n by n. So n is the number of points. We have the number of points in each dimension. And it will have a 0 on all those that are not within the number of neighbors we specified. So in this case, the 10 closest neighbors. Or a 1 if that pair of points is within the 10 nearest neighbors of each other. So this basically gives us a matrix that only allows linking together those points that are within the 10 nearest neighbors of each other. If we now use this matrix as a connectivity constraint on the agglomerative clustering, all the linkage between groups that we're going to use. So remember, agglomerative clustering will start with clusters of one element each. So all of these groups have only one example, and then we'll merge groups together in larger groups. Since we have this connectivity constraint here, only those that are within within the 10 nearest neighbors of each other will be able to form links between those groups. So this was what we had initially. Without connectivity constraints, we would find this sort of groups, and with connectivity constraints, now this part here, these examples are not grouped with these ones, because if we go along that graph with the 10 nearest neighbors for each of them, this goes along the strip and cannot jump from one side to the other. So we can add these kinds of constraints to capture some additional structure on our data and impose that on the agglomerative clustering algorithm. Here? No. This one? Okay. So the difference is these kinds of groups here no longer exist if we add the connectivity constraint. There is some effect here on the order that the plot is drawing the point. So the perspective is probably not very good, but it's not about the overlap. It's about how the spiral. No, they don't overlap. They are each point only belongs to one cluster or the other. So this is how you can use agglomerative clustering. You can specify the number of clusters you want at the end. So agglomerative clustering here is doing this hierarchically, but then it stops when it has the number of clusters that you desire, and actually can give you a partitional clustering with that number of clusters. You can use different measures for the distance between examples, the linkage between the groups, and so forth. There are these linkage options available in scikit-learn: complete linkage, average linkage, and word linkage if you use the Euclidean distance measure. So that's a constraint. You cannot use word linkage with other dissimilarity measures. There's some difference between using different linkage measures because of how you will favor larger groups or smaller groups relative to one another. So typically, if you use complete linkage, you are linking groups according to the largest distance of pairs of points between one cluster and the other, and this tends to make large clusters larger. So it favors the larger clusters and makes them gobble up more examples and become even larger. So this would be an example of clustering these data sets into 3 clusters using complete linkage. We can solve this partially using average linkage. For example, you see this red cluster here with average linkage now will not become so large, but usually what works best is word linkage. So trying to make clusters as compact as possible by minimizing the quadratic distance between the clusters and their centers. However, for this you need to always use Euclidean distance as a measure between of the distance between the points. But if you can do that, then usually this works best. Now we can do it the other way, hierarchical clustering by using divisive clustering, and in this case we start with all the examples in one cluster, and now we need an additional clustering algorithm that will split our cluster into subclusters, and then repeatedly use that algorithm to keep breaking down the clusters into smaller clusters. One often used algorithm for this is k-means with k equal to 2. So this is the bisecting k-means algorithm. It's a divisive hierarchical clustering algorithm that uses k-means to split large groups into 2 smaller groups, and then does this iteratively until we split everything. So we start with a single cluster. In all iterations we select one cluster, usually either the largest one or the one with some bad score, for example something like the silhouette score or the sum of squares errors or something like that. So we have a heuristic to select one candidate cluster to split, and then we split that cluster with a k-means using k equal to 2. And we keep doing this until we break everything down. So going back to the same data set, this would be the first split, and the second split, third split, and so on. In this case, the heuristic I'm using is picking the group with the largest number of points, of examples there, but there could be other heuristics depending on scores or something like that. But the end result will be we finish when we have everything broken down into individual examples. So every time one group becomes just one example, that one will no longer be split, and we keep splitting everything that has at least 2 examples until we get all the examples spread into different groups. Of course, we only need to do this if we want the complete tree. If we are interested only on the top levels of the tree, we can stop at any time when we have the desired number of clusters. So we can represent this as the first split, the second split, the third split, and so on, and we can represent the whole tree like this. And one advantage of divisive clustering is that at any point that we stop, we have every example inside the tree. So they may be grouped together into a single group, but they are all inside the tree. When we do agglomerative clustering, this does not happen. We can only join everything in the tree when we reach the top. Before that, we don't know how things will connect further on. So divisive clustering is good if you know how many levels you want on the tree or how many clusters you want to get in the end, and so you just stop there and you don't need to continue all the way down the tree. So if we were to do exhaustive search for the best clusters, we would have on the order of 2 raised to the number of points, because these were all the combinations of how to split our data. However, top-down clustering usually relies on some fast algorithm to do the split, like k-means with k equals to 2, which is very fast, and so we don't actually search everything, we just use that splitting algorithm as a fast way of building the tree. It can be a good option even if we have a very large data set, if we want few clusters, because in that case we don't need to split many times, we just need a few iterations until we have the results that we want. So now let's see a different application of clustering. So far we've been clustering examples on our data, but we can use clustering for grouping together similar features. And the idea is, it's easy to picture, would be something like this. We have typically these matrices where we have each feature in one column and each example in one row. This is what you've always been using. So we have n examples here, m features in the column. When we use clustering, we are grouping together similar rows in this matrix, because we are grouping together examples that have similar values on the features. But we can imagine what would happen if we were to transpose the matrix, and now the features that we had originally would actually be examples that we were going to cluster, and the different examples would be the features, would be the columns here. So basically, what are we trying to cluster here? We are trying to cluster the features that have similar values across all the examples. So, for example, suppose that feature 1 and feature 9 always had similar values in all the examples. So, they had not similar values in all the examples, but the values were highly correlated. So, it has, if it has one value here in example 1, it would be similar to in this feature 1 and feature 9, and example 2 would have a similar value in feature 1 and feature 9, and so forth. Then the vectors that would correspond to feature 1 in all the examples and feature 9 in all the examples would be similar to one another. So we could use that to bring together features that are similar across our examples in this sense, and then simplify the representation of our data by reducing the number of features. So let's see this in a more concrete example. This is the modified handwritten digits data set. This is a standard data set for machine learning. And these are taken from scans of handwritten digits. They were all rescaled to the same size and centered on each image. And each image is an 8 by 8 pixels grayscale image. So we have 64 features for each handwritten digit. And here you have several examples of 0, several examples of 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Now we can take this representation. So this, you can imagine, this is a matrix with 1,797 rows, because these are the different examples of handwritten digits that we have. And it has 64 columns, because these are the 64 pixels of each image. So the values for the 64 pictures in each image are the 64 features. We can now convert this into 64 examples of 1,797 features each. So this would be transposing the matrix. We consider to have 64 examples. Each of them is one of the pixels, and the features are the brightness of the pixel across all the digit image that we have. And now we're also going to create a linkage constraint so that only pixels that are adjacent to each other can be linked together, so that we, in the end, the clusters correspond always to adjacent pixels in the image. So how we can do this? We start with the original data. We will load the digit data. You can use this data from scikit-learn here in data sets. So you see this module has examples of data sets for machine learning. So this low digits gives you the handwritten digits data set, and we get the images from there. And now we're going to reshape. So we have an array of images. We're going to reshape this so that we have one row per image and as many columns as needed. So this -1 here in reshaping indicates to NumPy to get as many columns as necessary to fit the data into that number of rows. So basically, we're flattening out each image into a row on our table with 64 values, and we get each example in each row. Now we're going to build a connectivity graph. Basically, it's that matrix of zeros and ones, but this is done using this grid to graph function where you can specify the shape of a grid, and it gives you the connectivity of the adjacent cells in the grid. So basically, we are getting a series of zeros and ones indicating where which pixels are adjacent to other pixels with a 1, and those that are not adjacent get a 0. This is what we now can use in agglomerative clustering to constrain the groups to only include pixels that are adjacent to each other. So this would be the connectivity constraint. Now, sorry? Yes, I can show. This is the kind of thing you see. So clusters are only generated by pixels that are connected to each other, because we restrict the linkage there. We cannot have a cluster that is part over here and then part over here, because there would be no links joining them together. Okay? So we don't use agglomerative clustering, that clustering class. We use this one, feature agglomeration, which is the same algorithm, but it's already adapted to do feature clustering, so we don't need to transpose the matrix ourselves and so on. So basically, we use this one to agglomerate our data set, which has each example in a row and the original features in columns, but it will agglomerate by the features, and then it allows us to transform into a new data set that has a smaller number of columns, so in this case only 16 columns, by averaging all those features that fall in the same cluster. Or we can do this inverse transform where we project back to the original features, but all those features that belong to the same cluster will get a copy of the same value. So we can see how things look like in the original space. So this is the clusters that were created. This is the 8 by 8 bit image, 8 by 8 pixels image where the digits are written, and these are the regions that agglomerative clustering found to be similar. So basically here we tend to have values that are similar to each other. Over here also, here things vary a bit more, and we can project this back into the pixels. This would be the original data, and this here is the simplified data with only 16 different values. So you see these blocks here on the side are all homogeneous, are all the same. Other blocks here also get the same values because they belong to the same cluster of features. So basically, we reduce from 64 features into 16 features. We can actually now represent analogous images only with 4 by 4 pixels. This would be the 64 of them. Note that these no longer look like handwritten digits, because now we are only using the averages of those pixels and representing them into a 4 by 4 grid. But you still can see that zeros have one shape, ones have another, twos have another, so they are different. They are simplified representations by clustering the features, but they still retain this regularity, their differences. Sorry, here? These are the same ones. These are these zeros here. These are the ones, these, and so forth. In the linkage constraint? For this? Uh-huh. So here, when you use grid to graph, you give the shape of the grid, and it will return a matrix which indicates with a 1 or the coordinate pairs that are adjacent. So basically, if you have this, this is 8 by 8, so it's 64 possibilities. This returns a 64 by 64 matrix that has a 1 representing the set of coordinates in this, or the set of cells that you have that are adjacent to each other in the original grid. So this connectivity constraint is what forces the agglomerative clustering algorithm to build clusters like this, and not just join some pixel here with some pixel here because they share similar values across the different numbers. Okay, so we are constraining the way the clusters are built by requiring linkage only between adjacent pixels in the image. So to sum up, we saw this idea of hierarchical clustering of buildings. Yes. Yes, it's the average in this case. This is done automatically here. When you do the transform, it will cluster, so fit will compute the cluster, and then transform will return a matrix with only these columns, so the number of clusters that you specified, and the value there is the average of the values in all the pixels belonging to the cluster for that particular image. So for each example, it will average those that belong to the cluster and put there. So to sum up, we saw the hierarchical clustering idea of nesting clusters inside one another, and we saw two different approaches. We can start with all clusters having only one example each, and then group them together into larger and larger clusters until we reach the top of the tree. Or we can start from the top of the tree with everything in one large cluster and then split them apart until we reach either the bottom, which is all the examples separated, or whatever level of the tree we want to reach. We also saw different linkage options, and also the difference between the dissimilarity measure we use to compare different examples and the linkage measure we use to compare different groups. So remember that even if you can measure distance between two different points, if you have two different groups of points, now there is a question of how you're going to measure the distance between them. If it's the centers, the average distance, the maximum distance, and so on. And this affects how the groups are then brought together when you're doing this kind of hierarchical clustering. Then we saw agglomerative clustering, which is an algorithm that does hierarchical clustering, but we can stop at any point and get that number of clusters. In this case, if we do it agglomeratively, we don't know how the tree will be like on top of those clusters because we stop the process in the middle of reaching, before reaching the top of the tree. If we do the divisive clustering, then we have an idea of how the tree is shaping as we are separating the clusters. And we saw how to use this for combining features together. So we're clustering features instead of clustering the examples, and then we can combine the clustered features together and simplify the representation of our data set. So you can see more on these types of clustering on the scikit-learn documentation and also on Alpida.